As I mentioned before, issue number 0 of Warlord came after doing the whole Super Wars and Cyber Wars stuff in junior high school with my friends. When I transitioned into high school, I was no longer in regular contact with my friends since we went to different schools at the time, since we didn't really live in the same county. So I started to develop more personal stories with the characters that I had created throughout that span of seventh through ninth grade. And I was doing a couple of zero issues, like I mentioned before, with other pre existing characters that eventually took form in one shape or another into the Warlord comics that are presently available online, such as Exorcist, Danger Zone. There is another comic actually that I do, another web comic called DTF6, Delta Task Force 6, which I also did a number 0 and actually a mini series as well. It's probably the material I've done the most outside of Warlord. But back then it was actually called Ultra Force and not Delta Task Force 6. I had come out with the name Ultra Force because I don't know. To a little kid, that name sounded kind of cool, I guess. That was before the Ultraverse in the 90s was born, of course, and eventually Ultraverse had their own comic called Ultra Force as well, which was essentially their version of the Avengers, pitting their, or rather combining the more popular characters of that line, combining them with other newer characters as well to form a super team Avengers Justice League kind of thing. So when I decided to do Ultra Force properly and do it like as a web comic as well, after I started doing Warlord online, that's why I changed the name to something so um, that was different enough to keep it separated from the property that came out in the 90s, but still have a hint of what it used to be when I first created it. So I did those series of issue number zeros, and I ended up doing Fred Peterson the Mighty Warlord number 0 because I was inspired by the ongoing series of The Ray, which was written by Christopher Priest and illustrated by Howard Porter. And again, just like back in seventh grade when the miniseries came out by Jack C. Harris and Joe Quesada, that was the comic that made me want to make comics. When the Ray, the ongoing series came out, that was the comic that made me want to do an actual, you know, series eventually of comics, even though it wasn't necessarily perhaps Warlord at the time that I wanted to do. That's kind of why I was feeling out all these different characters and issues number zeros that I was doing in notebooks. And I ended up doing issue number 0 of The Mighty Warlord. Again, very, very inspired by Christopher Priest. And to this day, he is my all time favorite writer. I really had a great honor of meeting him a couple of times in New York Comic Con, and in one Comic Con I actually got to pick his brain a little bit after a panel he did. He was gracious enough to talk with me for a little bit actually, and that was so cool to be able to talk with him like that, you know, on a more personal, private note. So we spoke for a little while, then picked his brain a little bit more after a panel he was giving about his experience writing comic books and such, and his writing style, which made so much sense. A lot of the stories that he wrote back then for The Ray, specifically as well. Like I was so happy that he actually mentioned specific stories of that series, the how he came about doing that story and what inspired him and what real life aspects from his personal life kind of reflected on that particular story as well was just amazing and just fascinating to listen to. So issue number 0 of Warlord was very, very Christopher Priest inspired, and the artwork to an extent also was very inspired by Howard Porter as well. Kind of like a combination of Joe Quesada and Howard Porter, really. And a lot of my friends that eventually got to read that issue number 0 of Warlord were actually very happy with it. They really, really liked it. Um, but when I personally finished reading that issue, I kind of felt like Fred Peterson was a dick. Like he was not a very likable character, and even though the argument can be made that this is a character that even back then went through so much trauma and went through so many traumatic events, that it's perfectly understandable for that kind of character to be kind of bitter and whatnot. But I felt like I could have made him a little bit more likable, a little more relatable, at least. Make him feel more redeemable, I guess, in a way, because he felt a little too angry and bitter. I don't know if it was like parts of my own personal life that were kind of seeping through since it was a relatively difficult transition going into high school. As I mentioned before, I've always been an introvert, and when I started over in high school, I pretty much remained by myself, especially like that first few weeks, maybe a month. I pretty much didn't talk to anyone in the classroom, not because they were bad kids or anything like that, or because I thought I was better than anyone. I just, wanted to be chill by my own and be working on my artwork. And somehow, again, like, for some reason, kids always gravitated to me, the other classmates, and it didn't even matter what kind of quote unquote social ranking they had in high school or what group they would belong to, whether it be the metalheads, the rappers, the potheads, the Christians, the Satanists, the popular kids, the outcast. At one point or another, they would all come towards me just to talk. And even though I'm an introvert and I seek to be alone, if somebody comes to talk to me, even back then, I would just talk back because I didn't want to be rude either. So it was kind of frustrating in a way. And of course, along with all the regular growing pains of being a teenager, I guess a lot of that kind of bitterness may be reflected more on Fred Peterson in that particular issue. And it was a nice little story, I guess, for the time that I had made it. Um, it was a nice little story for the time that I had made it. It was basically, by the end, he was a little more likable compared to how he was in the beginning. It was a story revolving around Fred and, of course, Jane Jackson, which is pretty much the co-protagonist of the webcomic as well. One character that I had created before Fred Peterson that also became part of the cast as well, a huge part of the cast, arguably the most important addition to the cast of Fred Peterson, the Mighty Warlord. A lot of the stories, especially as they are now, would never have happened without without Jane becoming a huge part of that story. So it was essentially them, a story revolving around them and Fred kind of starting to slowly mend from a lot of those traumatic experiences, and also kind of coming to terms with certain situations that I don't want to spoil. Some of those situations actually already happened in the webcomic, but again, there's certain elements that haven't played out in the webcomic just yet, so I don't want to give it away just yet either. Suffice to say, like, it's a lot of healing started for that character in that issue number 0, even though I wish he he wasn't as bitter as the character was when he started out. Eventually, when I started working on the ongoing series in the notebooks, which I'll talk about later on in the week, that's when I decided to kind of break the character down completely and slowly start rebuilding him to essentially what he is today. So that's pretty much the insights for issue number 0 of the Notebook series. I'll definitely be talking about more creators and stories that inspired me to do Fred Peterson, the Mighty Warlord during Veda, sorry, Veda 2022, which again I'm kind of just combining it with Fred Peterson, the Mighty Warlord month because it is the anniversary month of the webcomic. Thank you all so much for listening, and I'll catch you all next time.